Lisa Hemings, a 35-year-old widow with a sharp, analytical mind and a lifelong love of puzzles, had always found solace in the home she and her late husband built together. Nestled on a secluded island surrounded by a gently flowing river, the house wasn't just a home, it was a masterpiece of their shared imagination, a testament to their bond and creativity. The couple had painstakingly designed every inch of the property, blending practicality with a whimsical charm that reflected their personalities. Access to the house was only possible via a single wooden bridge, an aging but sturdy structure that added to the location's secluded beauty. For Lisa, the bridge was more than just a means of crossing. It was a symbol of the connection she had shared with her husband. It was the first thing they had rebuilt together after purchasing the property, and the last project they completed before his untimely passing. After her husband's death, Lisa had thrown herself into the house and its hidden secrets, a hobby they had shared. Her late husband, a man who adored riddles and challenges, had left the home scattered with cryptic clues and mechanisms, transforming it into a labyrinth of personal mysteries. Some doors only opened with specific patterns of light, shelves concealed hidden compartments that contained notes, trinkets, and puzzles he'd left behind. He had once told her, in a hushed, playful tone, "If anything ever happens to me, this house will keep you guessing, and you'll always find me here." Those words had become her lifeline, a promise she clung to as she navigated her grief. It was a brisk autumn morning when Lisa returned home from her daily walk through the nearby forest, her thoughts preoccupied with plans to repair the bridge. She had recently noticed that the structure was beginning to show its age. Some of the wooden planks were warped, and the handrails needed reinforcement. While the bridge was still functional, Lisa had taken to planning her repairs meticulously, consulting old blueprints and jotting down notes. It wasn't just a necessity. It was another way to honor her husband's legacy, one project at a time. When she approached the riverbank, something felt wrong. The familiar silhouette of the bridge was gone. Instead, there was an empty void where the structure had stood for decades. Lisa froze, her heart pounding. All that remained were splintered fragments of wood scattered along the edges of the river. A cold breeze swept across the water, carrying the faint scent of sawdust and something metallic and acrid. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her boots sinking into the muddy bank. Then she saw it, a large, garish sign planted in the ground where the bridge's supports had once been. HOA Infrastructure Improvement Project, closed for safety. The bold letters stared back at her, their sterile, bureaucratic tone clashing with the chaotic destruction before her. Lisa's hands curled into fists. What was the HOA doing here? She wasn't even a member of the association. Her property had always been explicitly excluded from their jurisdiction, a fact her husband had ensured when they bought the land. Lisa scanned the scene, her mind racing. There had been no warning, no letter, no phone call. How could they just come onto her property and demolish the bridge without her knowledge or consent? The bridge wasn't merely a functional necessity, it was her only access to the mainland. Without it, she was trapped on the island, cut off from the rest of the world. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was stranded. Frantically, Lisa pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she tried to call the HOA's listed number. The line rang and rang, then clicked to voicemail. She left a terse message, her voice shaking with anger. "This is Lisa Hemings. You've destroyed my bridge. I need an explanation immediately. Call me back." She hung up and paced along the riverbank, her mind a whirlwind of fear and fury. As she paced, Lisa noticed something unusual among the debris scattered along the shore. A series of saw marks on the wooden planks looked deliberate, precise, too clean to be the result of decay or accidental damage. Someone had dismantled the bridge intentionally, piece by piece. Her eyes narrowed. This wasn't just negligence or an oversight. It was a calculated act. The sign, the methodical destruction, the complete lack of communication, it all pointed to one conclusion: this was no mistake. But why? And what did the HOA have to gain from cutting her off from the mainland? Lisa's stomach churned as she considered the possibilities. She thought of the letters her husband had received from the HOA years ago, insisting that their property should fall under its control. He had fought them off with legal documents, proof that their land was outside the HOA's reach. She hadn't thought about those disputes in years, but now they resurfaced with chilling clarity. Lisa's jaw tightened as she looked back at the sign, its stark black and white lettering a mockery of her isolation. She wasn't just trapped, she was a target. And if the HOA thought they could bulldoze her life the way they had dismantled her bridge, they were in for a rude awakening. Lisa spent the next hour circling the remnants of the bridge, trying to piece together what had happened. The destruction was too calculated, too precise. Whoever had done this had not only taken their time, but had done so without the slightest concern for the consequences. Her phone had no signal. As expected, she was too far from the mainland for a reliable connection. With no other option, she trudged back to the house, her mind racing. She would need to find a way across the river. For now, her anger gave her focus. Inside the house, Lisa rummaged through the storage room, finding an old coil of rope and a few pieces of wood that could act as makeshift paddles. Her husband had always joked about building a raft for emergencies, but they had never gotten around to it. Now the joke had turned into grim necessity. She lashed together planks of wood, testing each knot with meticulous care. The work steadied her hands, but her thoughts kept returning to the same questions. Why would the HOA do this? What gave them the authority to touch her property, let alone destroy her only connection to the mainland? Once the makeshift raft was ready, Lisa carried it down to the riverbank, her muscles straining against the weight. The water was freezing, and a steady current threatened to pull her off course. She tied the raft to a tree and made one final check of the knots. Satisfied, she untied the rope, stepped onto the unsteady platform, and pushed off from the shore. The raft groaned under her weight, but it held. The crossing was slow and treacherous. Icy water splashed over her boots as she used the paddle to fight the current. Her hands ached from the cold, but she forced herself to keep moving, one stroke at a time. When she finally reached the opposite shore, she collapsed onto the damp ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment she allowed herself to rest, staring up at the gray sky. Then the determination returned. She had to confront the HOA and find out what they had done. Lisa followed the dirt path that led to the HOA's main office, a nondescript building nestled at the edge of the nearby town. The structure was plain and unassuming, with a small parking lot and a neatly trimmed lawn. It looked harmless enough, but Lisa knew better. She had read about HOA horror stories, residents bullied into compliance, properties seized over minor violations, families driven out of their homes. She had never imagined she would become one of their victims. Inside, the air was cold and sterile. A receptionist with a tight smile sat behind the front desk, typing on a keyboard. Lisa approached, her wet boots squeaking against the tile floor. "Can I help you?" The receptionist asked, barely looking up. "You demolished my bridge," Lisa said, her voice low and sharp. "I'm not even part of your HOA. Who gave you the right to do this?" The receptionist blinked, as if caught off guard by Lisa's intensity. She straightened in her chair and folded her hands on the desk. "What's your name and property address?" "Lisa Hemmings, 227 Riverview Lane." The receptionist tapped the information into her computer, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she frowned. "Your property was recently added to the HOA's jurisdiction as part of an infrastructure improvement plan. The bridge was deemed unsafe and removed to prevent potential accidents. You should have received a notice about this." "I received nothing," Lisa snapped. "No letters, no warnings, no phone calls. You've stranded me on my property. What do you expect me to do now?" The receptionist's polite mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flicker of irritation. "You'll need to speak with our development coordinator about that. Please wait here." Lisa crossed her arms and leaned against the counter, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She could feel the stares of the other employees in the office, their curious glances making her skin crawl. After a few minutes, a man in a crisp suit emerged from a side door. He looked to be in his 50s, with silver hair and the practiced smile of someone used to diffusing conflict. "Ms. Hemmings, I'm Tom Bradford, the development coordinator. How can I assist you today?" Lisa clenched her fists. "You can start by explaining why your HOA destroyed my bridge without my permission. I'm not a member of this association, and my property has always been outside your jurisdiction." Bradford's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed slightly. I understand your frustration, Nems. Hemmings. However, our records show that your property was incorporated into the HOA's boundaries as part of a community safety initiative. The bridge was inspected by our engineers and found to be structurally unsound. It posed a significant risk, so we took immediate action to remove it. Immediate action? Lisa repeated, her voice rising. You didn't consult me. You didn't even bother to inform me. That bridge was the only way on or off my property. Bradford spread his hands in a gesture of feigned sympathy. We regret any inconvenience this has caused, but the safety of the community is our top priority. A replacement bridge is planned as part of the project. In the meantime, we encourage you to consider alternate arrangements. Lisa felt her blood boil. Alternate arrangements? You've cut me off from the world, and you think that's acceptable? What kind of scam are you running here? Bradford's smile tightened. Ms. Hemmings, if you have concerns about the HOA's actions, I suggest you submit a formal complaint. I assure you, everything we've done is in accordance with our bylaws and local regulations. Lisa took a step closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You had no right to touch my property. I'm going to find out exactly what you've done, and I'll make sure you answer for it. Bradford's polite demeanor cracked for just a moment, his eyes hardening. I suggest you tread carefully, Ms. Hemmings. This is a matter of community interest, not personal grievance. Have a good day. Without another word, Lisa turned on her heel and marched out of the building. Her mind was racing, a storm of anger and confusion. Something about Bradford's tone unsettled her, as if he knew more than he was letting on. As she walked back to the riverbank, a voice called out to her. She turned to see an elderly fisherman sitting by the water, his face weathered and kind. You're the lady from the island, aren't you? He asked. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Did you see what happened to my bridge? The fisherman's expression darkened. A few nights ago, I saw a group of men working on it. They had heavy equipment cutting through the wood. One of them kept saying something about a postal code. You looked like they were in a hurry to get it done before anyone noticed. Lisa's stomach churned. A postal code? What could that mean? She thanked the fisherman and made her way back to the raft, her thoughts swirling. As she crossed the river again, Lisa's determination solidified. The HOA wasn't just playing games, they were up to something far bigger than a simple safety project. And she was going to find out what it was, no matter the cost. Back on the island, Lisa found herself pacing the living room, her hands trembling as she clutched the piece of paper she had taken from the HOA office, a formal notice that her property was now part of their jurisdiction, complete with a map showing the boundaries they had expanded. The map marked her home as part of an area labeled Phase II redevelopment, alongside vague references to utility upgrades and community improvements. None of it made sense. Her husband had been meticulous when they bought this property, ensuring that it was exempt from the HOA's reach. How could this have changed? Frustration gnawed at her as she rifled through the old wooden desk in the study, searching for anything her husband might have left behind: deeds, legal agreements, correspondence with the HOA. The desk was cluttered with papers, and Lisa's pulse quickened as she dug deeper. Her husband had been brilliant, but his organizational habits left much to be desired. Finally, she unearthed a manila envelope labeled HOA Exemption Agreement. Her hands shook as she opened it and pulled out the documents. There it was, a signed, notarized agreement explicitly stating that her property was excluded from HOA governance, along with a letter from the original developer of the area confirming that the bridge and the island were entirely private. But as Lisa examined the document more closely, she noticed something unsettling. At the bottom of the page, there was a small annotation in red ink, something that hadn't been there before. It was a code, followed by a date 072123. Lisa's heart sank. That was only 3 months ago. Someone had added this note after her husband's death, likely when the HOA began its so-called infrastructure improvements. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. Someone within the HOA had altered the records to claim jurisdiction over her property. This wasn't negligence or miscommunication. It was deliberate. Desperate for answers, Lisa headed down to the riverbank, her thoughts racing. She needed to piece this puzzle together, and fast. As she paced along the shore, her foot struck something half buried in the mud. She crouched down and unearthed a small metallic cylinder, its surface scratched and weathered. It was about the size of a thermos, with a keyhole at the top. Lisa turned it over in her hands, her mind flashing back to the scavenger hunts her husband used to organize for her. This felt like one of his puzzles, deliberate, cryptic, and meant to lead her somewhere. She carried the cylinder back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at it. The keyhole suggested it was meant to be opened, but where was the key? Her husband had always been a step ahead, leaving clues that required her to think outside the box. She rummaged through the drawers in the study, searching for anything that might fit. Finally, in the bottom of a locked drawer, she found an old key with a tag that read, "For when you need it most." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She inserted the key into the cylinder and turned it. The mechanism clicked, and the lid popped open, revealing a folded piece of paper and a small brass object. The paper contained a handwritten note from her husband, the words scrawled in his unmistakable handwriting. "Lisa, if you're reading this, it means something has gone terribly wrong. The house is more than just our home, it's part of something bigger. Follow the numbers. Trust yourself. And remember, the answers are always close to home." Below the note was a series of equations and symbols that made little sense at first glance. Lisa frowned, her mind already working to decode the message. The brass object, she realized, was a key but not for a lock. It was a marker, shaped like an arrow, with a groove that suggested it fit into something. Her heart racing, Lisa thought back to the house itself. If her husband had hidden this clue, it had to lead somewhere significant. She scanned the note again, her eyes landing on the phrase "close to home." That was his way of saying the next step was nearby. She grabbed a flashlight and began searching the house, starting in the living room. Hours later, after combing through shelves, floorboards, and hidden compartments, Lisa discovered a panel behind one of the bookshelves that didn't quite sit flush with the wall. She pried it open with a screwdriver, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a dusty old map of the island and the surrounding area. It was hand-drawn, with annotations in her husband's handwriting marking key locations. One of the annotations caught her attention immediately, a faint dotted line leading from the riverbank to an area labeled tunnel access. Her pulse quickened. A tunnel. Lisa studied the map closely, noting that the access point was near the base of the old bridge. She grabbed her flashlight and headed back to the riverbank, following the map's instructions. The air was cold and damp as she worked her way through the underbrush, her boots squelching in the mud. When she reached the marked spot, Lisa saw what looked like an old drainage grate partially concealed by vines and debris. She cleared away the vegetation and found a rusted metal hatch, its edges corroded from years of exposure. The brass marker from the cylinder fit perfectly into the groove on the hatch's lock. Lisa turned it, and with a loud creak, the hatch opened. The air inside was stale and musty, but Lisa pressed forward, descending a narrow metal ladder into the darkness. Her flashlight illuminated a tunnel that stretched far beneath the island, its walls lined with old brick and damp with condensation. Pipes and electrical wiring ran along the ceiling, suggesting that the tunnel had once been part of a larger system. As Lisa ventured deeper, she came across a series of storage crates, their sides stamped with the logo of a company she didn't recognize. She pried one of them open with a crowbar she had found near the entrance, revealing a stack of documents and what looked like technical blueprints. The documents were stamped with the HOA's logo, but the content was far more sinister. They detailed plans for Phase II redevelopment, including the seizure of her property and the construction of a high-end residential complex. Lisa's hands trembled as she flipped through the papers. The blueprints included not just her house, but the entire island, marked as a critical access point for some kind of underground infrastructure. Her home wasn't just in the way, it was central to their plans. She stuffed the papers into her bag and kept moving, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Further down the tunnel, she found a metal door slightly ajar. Inside was what looked like an abandoned operations room, complete with monitors, control panels, and more crates of equipment. On one of the monitors, a live feed displayed the riverbank near her house. They were watching her. Panic surged through Lisa as she realized the scope of what she was up against. This wasn't just about the HOA wanting her land. They were running something far larger, and her house was at the center of it. She had to act quickly, but for the first time, she felt truly out of her depth. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of a name scrawled on one of the blueprints: Project Lead B. Carter. She didn't know who B. Carter was, but she would find out. One thing was clear: this wasn't over, and Lisa wasn't going to let them win. Lisa returned to the house in a haze of exhaustion, her mind spinning with everything she had uncovered in the tunnel. The live feed of her riverbank was seared into her thoughts, a chilling reminder that someone was watching her every move. She dropped her bag of stolen documents onto the kitchen table and leaned against the counter, trying to steady her breathing. The implications of what she had found were staggering. Her home wasn't just collateral damage in a bureaucratic land grab, it was the key to something much larger, something hidden beneath the island itself. After a moment, she pulled the papers out of the bag and spread them across the table, turning the kitchen into a makeshift war room. Each blueprint, map, and document painted a clearer picture of the HOA's plan. The island was to be converted into a centralized hub for some kind of underground infrastructure. The details were vague, but certain terms kept appearing: subterranean access point, Phase II utilities integration, and secure routing zone. None of it made sense to her, but one thing was clear: the destruction of the bridge wasn't about safety or convenience. It was about control. The name B. Carter stood out, scrawled in a bold signature on several of the documents. Lisa stared at it, her fingers tracing the ink as she tried to place it. Who was this person? A leader within the HOA? A corporate figure tied to the redevelopment plans? Whoever they were, they had enough authority to mark her property as a critical site for their project. Lisa turned her attention back to the map she had found in the hidden compartment. The dotted line marking the tunnel was only part of the story. Other lines extended outward from her property, branching beneath the river and into the nearby town. The network was vast, sprawling, and meticulously planned. It wasn't just her home they were targeting, it was the entire area. Her husband's note echoed in her mind. The answers are always close to home. She studied the map again, this time focusing on the annotations her husband had made. One mark in particular caught her attention: a small X drawn near the base of the house, just beneath the foundation. It was labeled simply Key. Grabbing her flashlight, Lisa made her way to the basement. The space was dark and cluttered, filled with boxes of old tools, paint cans, and supplies. Her husband had used the basement as a workshop, and she hadn't touched it much since his passing. Now, as she scanned the room, she looked for anything that could match the X on the map. Her eyes landed on a small patch of concrete in the far corner that seemed out of place. The floor was smooth and uniform everywhere else, but this section was slightly raised, as if it had been added later. Lisa knelt down and ran her fingers along the edge, feeling for a seam. Sure enough, there was a faint crack where the patch met the original floor. She retrieved a crowbar from a nearby shelf and wedged it into the seam. With a grunt of effort, she pried the patch loose, revealing a small compartment hidden beneath the concrete. Inside was a locked metal box, its surface tarnished with age. Lisa's heart raced as she pulled it out and placed it on the workbench. The box had a combination lock, but no keyhole. She frowned, trying to think. Her husband wouldn't have left something like this without providing a way to open it. The thought struck her suddenly: the equations from the cylinder. She ran back upstairs to retrieve the paper and spread it out on the workbench next to the box. The equations were a series of numbers and symbols, each one seemingly unrelated to the next. But as Lisa studied them, she noticed a pattern. The equations weren't meant to be solved, they were coordinates. Her husband had written them in a sequence that corresponded to the combination lock. She carefully entered the numbers into the dials: 4723. With a soft click, the lock released, and the box opened. Inside was a second map, more detailed than the first. This one showed not just the tunnel beneath her property, but a series of hidden rooms and pathways that extended deep underground. At the center of the map was a large chamber labeled Vault. The annotation read, "Primary access restricted." Lisa's pulse quickened. The vault had to be the central hub of whatever operation the HOA was running. If she could find it, she might be able to uncover the full extent of their plans and figure out a way to stop them. But reaching the vault wouldn't be easy. The map showed multiple security checkpoints, dead ends, and other obstacles designed to keep intruders out. As she studied the map, Lisa noticed a faint line connecting the vault to her house. It wasn't part of the main tunnel network. It was a separate passageway, hidden and unmarked on the HOA's blueprints. Her husband had labeled it escape route. A chill ran down Lisa's spine. Her husband had known about the vault, about the tunnel network, and about the HOA's plans long before they had targeted her property. He had built the house with this knowledge, embedding clues and safeguards to protect her when the time came. Lisa's determination hardened. She would follow the escape route and find the vault. But first, she needed to prepare. The tunnels were dangerous, and the HOA had already proven they were willing to do whatever it took to secure their plans. The next day, Lisa gathered supplies, flashlights, rope, a first aid kit, and a utility knife. She also retrieved an old hand crank radio from the attic, hoping it might help her monitor any signals from the surface. Every step felt like a race against time. She knew the HOA wouldn't sit idle for long. As night fell, Lisa descended into the tunnel once more, using the escape route to bypass the main passageways. The air grew colder and heavier as she moved deeper underground, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the damp walls. Her flashlight illuminated the path ahead, revealing rusted pipes and crumbling brickwork. After what felt like hours, Lisa reached a metal door marked with the same emblem she had seen on the documents, a circular logo with the initials BC, etched into the surface. She pushed the door open and stepped into a large chamber filled with machinery, filing cabinets, and monitors. The air was thick with the fume of electricity, and the faint glow of screens illuminated the room. On one of the monitors, Lisa saw a live feed of her house. The camera was hidden somewhere in the trees, its lens trained on the front door. Her blood ran cold. They weren't just watching her, they were waiting for her to make a move. As she moved through the chamber, Lisa found a control panel with a series of switches and buttons. One of them was labeled Vault Security Override. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the switch. If she disabled the security, she could access the vault, but it would also alert the HOA to her presence. Taking a deep breath, Lisa flipped the switch. The room plunged into darkness as the machinery powered down. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from somewhere deeper in the tunnels, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps. They were coming for her. Lisa grabbed the documents she could carry and bolted back toward the escape route, her flashlight swinging wildly as she ran. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the tunnels like a drumbeat. She didn't look back. When she finally reached the surface, Lisa collapsed onto the riverbank, her chest heaving with exertion. The stolen documents were crumpled in her hands, their edges damp with sweat. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had enough to know one thing: the HOA wasn't just after her land. They were hiding something far bigger and far more dangerous. Lisa's escape from the tunnels left her shaken but more determined than ever. The documents she had salvaged offered only fragments of the bigger picture, but one thing was clear: the HOA wasn't just targeting her home for redevelopment. Her property and the tunnels beneath it were vital to a larger operation, and whoever was pulling the strings would stop at nothing to secure their plans. As she spread the crumpled blueprints and files across her kitchen table once again, Lisa tried to piece together the puzzle. What was the vault hiding? Why was her home connected to this shadowy network? And who was B? Carter, the name scrawled on so many of the documents. The live feed of her house she had seen on the monitors haunted her. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside the windows made her jump. They were watching her. They knew she was onto them, and Lisa could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on her, even if she couldn't see them. It was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about survival. That night, Lisa fortified her home as best she could. She dragged heavy furniture in front of the windows, locked every door, and activated the few security measures her husband had installed years ago. The cameras around the house had been offline since the bridge's destruction, but Lisa didn't trust them anymore. Instead, she positioned a series of makeshift traps near the front and back doors simple but effective deterrents that would give her a warning if someone tried to break in. Her paranoia proved justified. Around midnight, she was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside her house. Lisa froze, her breath caught in her throat. The steps were slow, deliberate, as if the person or people outside were testing the perimeter. Grabbing her flashlight and utility knife, she crept to the window and peeked out from behind the heavy curtain. Two figures stood near the edge of the property, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by caps and masks. One of them carried a clipboard, while the other shone a flashlight across the yard, the beams sweeping back and forth like a predator searching for prey. Lisa's heart pounded as she crouched lower, trying to stay out of sight. The figures moved closer, stopping near the remnants of the old bridge. She watched as the one with the clipboard gestured toward the house, then pointed at something on the ground. The other nodded, his flashlight lingering on the front door. They were planning something. As quietly as she could, Lisa backed away from the window and made her way to the hidden panel in the living room. She slid it open, revealing a small compartment where her husband had kept a handheld shortwave radio. She had tested it earlier that day and found it still worked, though the signal was weak. Now, as she turned the dial, static filled the room, broken occasionally by faint voices and bursts of garbled transmissions. Phase 2, initiate perimeter check. The words crackled through the static, barely intelligible, but enough to make Lisa's blood run cold. They were coordinating. The figures outside weren't just HOA contractors, they were part of something larger, something organized. Lisa's grip on the radio tightened as she considered her options. She couldn't call the police, not yet. The documents she had found implicated powerful figures, and she had no doubt the HOA would bury her claims as baseless conspiracy theories. She needed more proof, something undeniable. The next morning, Lisa ventured into town, keeping her movements cautious and deliberate. She avoided the main roads, using back alleys and side streets to stay out of sight. Her goal was simple: gather supplies and find out more about the HOA's recent activities. At the hardware store, she purchased tools, batteries, and a sturdy lock for the hatch leading to the tunnels. The cashier gave her a curious look, but said nothing as she paid in cash and left. From there, Lisa made her way to the local library, a small, dusty building that rarely saw visitors. She knew the HOA's reach extended into town. She had seen their signs and advertisements everywhere, but she hoped the library's archives might hold some clue about the organization's past. Hours passed as Lisa pored over old newspapers and town records, her eyes scanning for anything connected to B. Carter or the HOA's expansion projects. Most of the articles were mundane, detailing zoning disputes and minor community improvements. But one piece from several years ago caught her attention. It was a brief mention of a company called Carter Consolidated Infrastructure, or C, which had been contracted to install underground utilities in the area. Lisa's breath caught. The logo on the documents she had found in the tunnels, the circular emblem with the initials, was the same as the one in the article. She wasn't just a contractor. They were the entity behind the entire operation, and B. Carter was likely their founder or CEO. Her suspicions deepened as she dug further. Another article detailed a lawsuit against C, filed by a group of homeowners who alleged that the company had falsified safety reports to force them out of their properties. The case had been quietly settled, and the homeowners had disappeared from public view. Lisa's hands trembled as she printed out copies of the articles. She had found her smoking gun. The HOA was a front, a puppet controlled by she to seize land and expand their operations under the guise of community improvement. Her property wasn't just a target, it was a linchpin in their network, and they would stop at nothing to secure it. As Lisa left the library, her resolve hardened. She couldn't rely on the authorities to save her. She would have to confront the HOA directly, expose their corruption, and take back control of her home. That night, Lisa returned to the tunnels, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, as she retraced her steps to the chamber with the monitors. The room was empty now, the machinery powered down from her earlier sabotage. But as she scanned the area, she noticed something she had missed before: a series of wires leading from the control panel into the walls. Following the wires, Lisa discovered a hidden switch embedded in the brickwork. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing it. With a low rumble, a section of the wall slid aside, revealing a narrow passageway lined with more crates and equipment. At the end of the passage was another door, this one marked with the word vault. Lisa's heart raced as she approached. The door was locked, but the brass marker she had found earlier fit perfectly into the mechanism. With a twist, the lock disengaged, and the door creaked open. Inside was a massive chamber filled with rows of filing cabinets, digital servers, and storage units. The air was cold and sterile, and the hum of machinery echoed faintly in the distance. Lisa stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room. As she approached one of the storage units, she noticed a series of labels on the drawers: acquisition records, project timelines, security protocols. She opened one of the drawers and pulled out a thick file labeled Riverview Lane. The file contained everything: the forged documents that had added her property to the HOA's jurisdiction, the fake safety reports used to justify the bridge's destruction, and detailed plans for the underground network. It was all there, undeniable evidence of the HOA's corruption. But before Lisa could gather more, the sound of footsteps echoed from the passageway behind her. They had found her. She grabbed the file and bolted for the exit, her heart pounding as the footsteps grew louder. This time she wouldn't stop. She wouldn't rest. The HOA had underestimated her, and Lisa was about to show them just how dangerous that mistake would be. Lisa sprinted through the tunnels, clutching the stolen file tightly against her chest. The footsteps behind her grew louder, echoing through the damp brick walls like a relentless drumbeat. Her flashlight beam danced erratically across the passageway, her breathing ragged as adrenaline propelled her forward. She knew the layout of the tunnels well enough by now to navigate them quickly, but the figures pursuing her were closing in. She could hear their voices now, low and urgent. Turning a sharp corner, Lisa ducked into a narrow side passage and pressed herself against the wall. She killed the flashlight and held her breath, straining to hear. The footsteps slowed, and one of the voices barked out a command. "Spread out. She's got the file, don't let her reach the surface." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She couldn't afford to lose the evidence she'd risked everything to retrieve. It was her only leverage against the HOA, her only proof of their illegal activities. But the men pursuing her weren't going to stop until they had it back. Lisa reached into her bag and pulled out one of the small tools she had brought with her, a portable flare. She struck it against the wall, the sudden burst of light filling the narrow passageway with a harsh red glow. Holding the flare tightly, she hurled it back into the main tunnel, where it clattered noisily against the ground. The voices reacted instantly. "She's that way," one of them shouted, and the footsteps moved toward the flare. Lisa took the opportunity to slip further into the side passage, using the brief distraction to gain some distance. The narrow passage led her back to the main tunnel network, and she emerged near the base of the old escape hatch beneath her home. Her hands shook as she unlocked the hatch and climbed the ladder, the stolen file wedged under one arm. She could hear the men's voices growing fainter below, but she knew they would realize her trick soon enough. When she reached the surface, Lisa bolted the hatch shut and dragged a heavy storage chest over it to block the entrance. She didn't know how long it would hold, but it would have to be enough. Back inside her house, Lisa locked the doors and collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. She clutched the file like a lifeline, her mind racing. The evidence was damning: detailed records of the HOA's activities, their connections to she, and the forged documents they had used to claim her property. But more than that, the file revealed the true purpose of the vault. It wasn't just an underground hub for utilities. It was a secure storage site for something far more valuable: financial records, confidential communications, and sensitive assets tied to a network of high-level investors. The vault was the key to everything, and Lisa now understood why the HOA had gone to such lengths to seize her property. Her home wasn't just an obstacle to their plans, it was a crucial piece of the puzzle. As Lisa sifted through the documents, a knock at the front door startled her. She froze, her heart pounding. Another knock followed, this one more forceful. "Ms. Hemmings, open the door," a voice called out. It was calm, measured, and unmistakably authoritative. "We know you've been in the tunnels. Let's discuss this like adults." Lisa grabbed her utility knife and approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on the porch, flanked by two others in matching uniforms. They weren't local police. And they weren't HOA contractors. Their demeanor was too professional, their presence too calculated. "We don't want this to escalate," the man continued. "You've taken something that doesn't belong to you. Hand it over, and we can resolve this peacefully." Lisa's grip on the knife tightened. She had no intention of giving them the file, but she also knew she couldn't face them head-on. Stalling for time, she called out, "You broke into my property. What makes you think I'll just hand anything over to you?" The man's tone shifted, losing its veneer of politeness. "This isn't a negotiation, Mims. Hemmings. Open the door, or we'll open it for you." Lisa's mind raced. She couldn't let them take the evidence, but she was cornered. Then her eyes landed on the small panel her husband had installed near the fireplace, the trigger for the house's emergency mechanisms. It was one of the last puzzles he had left her, a failsafe for a situation just like this. She darted across the room and pressed the panel, activating the hidden mechanisms built into the house. A low rumble echoed through the walls as heavy metal shutters slid down over the windows, locking into place. The men outside shouted in surprise, pounding on the door as the house sealed itself like a fortress. Lisa didn't wait to hear their next move. She grabbed the file and ran to the basement, where she accessed the escape tunnel her husband had designed. The tunnel would take her away from the house and into the woods on the far side of the island, a path the intruders wouldn't expect. The tunnel was dark and narrow, but Lisa moved quickly, her flashlight cutting through the blackness. When she emerged into the woods, she crouched behind a cluster of trees and watched the house from a distance. The men were trying to breach the door, their voices muffled but angry. Lisa's heart ached as she realized the house, her sanctuary, was now a battleground. She couldn't let them have it. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out the small remote her husband had included in the failsafe system. With trembling hands, she activated the final mechanism. Inside the house, a series of controlled charges detonated, collapsing the tunnels beneath the structure and rendering the vault inaccessible. The blast echoed across the island, and the men outside scrambled back in shock. Lisa watched as smoke rose from the house, her eyes stinging with tears. It was gone. Everything they had built together, every memory, every piece of their shared life, it was all buried now. But she had protected it, just as her husband had intended. Clutching the file to her chest, Lisa turned and disappeared into the woods. She wasn't safe yet, but she had the upper hand. With the evidence in her possession, she had the power to expose the HOA and Cece for what they truly were, and she would use it. This wasn't just about her home anymore. It was about justice. The aftermath of the explosion lingered in Lisa's mind as she rowed her makeshift raft across the river in the dead of night. Smoke from her house still hung in the air behind her, a faint, bitter reminder of what she had lost. The home she and her husband had built together, the haven that held every piece of their shared life, was now nothing more than rubble. But the files clutched against her chest were proof that it hadn't been in vain. She had protected the one thing the HOA and Cece had truly wanted: the truth. Lisa reached the mainland, her arms aching from the effort. The current had been strong, and the cold seeped into her bones, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The men who had come for her would be regrouping, and the clock was ticking. She needed to act before they could recover. In the quiet hours before dawn, Lisa made her way to the only place she could think of that might offer her protection, the office of a local attorney, Sarah Grayson, whose reputation for taking on corrupt organizations had made her a thorn in the side of the HOA for years. Sarah had been a family friend once, someone Lisa's husband trusted implicitly. When Lisa arrived, drenched and shivering, Sarah didn't hesitate to let her in. The lawyer's sharp eyes scanned the documents Lisa laid out on the desk, her expression growing darker with each page. "This is more than just a land grab," Sarah said finally, her voice laced with anger. "This is systemic corruption. If we move fast, we can take this straight to the state attorney general." Lisa nodded, her throat tight. She hadn't fully realized the weight of what she had uncovered until now. The files didn't just implicate the HOA and CCI. They revealed a sprawling web of fraud, forged documents, and illegal seizures that stretched far beyond her island. Entire neighborhoods had been targeted, their properties stolen under the guise of redevelopment. Sarah wasted no time. She called in favors from her network of contacts, ensuring the evidence was safely duplicated and sent to multiple secure locations. By sunrise, Lisa's story and the incriminating files were in the hands of state investigators. The fallout was swift. Within days, the state attorney general announced an investigation into the HOA and C, citing the evidence Lisa had provided. News outlets picked up the story, painting a damning picture of the organization's tactics. B. Carter, whose name was plastered across the documents, became the face of the scandal, and his carefully constructed empire began to crumble. But for Lisa, the victory felt hollow. She had saved others from suffering the same fate, but she had lost the only place that had ever felt like home. The house was gone, and with it, the tangible pieces of her husband's legacy. Weeks later, Lisa received a letter in the mail. It came from an attorney representing her husband's estate, someone she hadn't known existed. Inside was a handwritten note from her husband, dated years before his death. "Lisa, if you're reading this, it means the worst has happened. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to face it with you, but I knew you'd be strong enough to see this through. The house was never meant to be the end, it was just a part of the journey. There's more for you out there. Don't let the past hold you back. I'll always be with you." Along with the note was a set of keys and a deed to a small cabin on the mainland, nestled deep in the woods. Her husband had bought it years ago, anticipating that she might one day need a fresh start. Lisa visited the cabin the next day. It wasn't the house she had lost, but it was peaceful, surrounded by trees and the soft sound of a nearby stream. Inside, she found a box filled with photographs, letters, and a few of the puzzles her husband had loved so much. As she stood on the porch, the sun filtering through the leaves, Lisa felt a sense of quiet resolve. She had lost so much, but she had also uncovered her own strength. The battle against the HOA had taken everything from her, but it had also reminded her of the one thing her husband had always believed: she was capable of surviving anything. The fight wasn't over, there were still hearings, legal battles, and rebuilding to be done. But for the first time in weeks, Lisa felt something close to hope. The truth was out, and the people responsible for the destruction of her home would face justice. And though her husband was gone, she knew his spirit was with her, guiding her toward a new chapter. Lisa stepped back inside the cabin, her heart heavier but stronger, ready to rebuild once more.